As Shaq O'Neal saw his daughter returning from school, his heart stopped at the devastating sight. Before him, the little girl was walking home from the bus wearing only a diaper, trembling with shame and fear. Shaq immediately rushed outside, wrapping his daughter in a protective embrace. As she sobbed, desperate to understand what had happened, when the girl revealed the truth about her teacher and the other terrible things he had done to her, Shaq's world crumbled and her words sent shivers down his spine. But the teacher had no idea who the little girl's father actually was. Soon he would be begging for mercy and regretting his actions bitterly. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Let's begin the story. It was a sunny afternoon, and Shaq was in his living room flipping through channels on the TV. He had just finished a workout and was relaxing before heading out for a community event later that evening. As he sat there, he heard the front door creak open. It was his youngest daughter, Mia, coming home from school. But something was off. Shaq turned his head and saw Mia standing in the doorway, her face red and tear-streaked. She was wearing nothing but a diaper. Shaq's heart dropped. He stood up immediately, his 7-foot frame towering over the room. "Mia, baby, what happened?" he asked, his voice soft, but filled with concern. Mia didn't answer. She just stood there, trembling, her eyes glued to the floor. Shaq knelt down to her level, his massive hands gently holding her shoulders. "Talk to me, sweetheart. Did someone hurt you?" Mia nodded, her lips quivering. "Mr. Callaway. He made me take off my clothes in front of everyone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Shaq's blood boiled. Mr. Callaway was Mia's teacher. How could someone who was supposed to protect and educate children do something so cruel? Shaq took a deep breath, trying to stay calm for Mia's sake. "Okay, baby, it's going to be okay. Daddy's here. No one's going to hurt you again." He picked her up and carried her to the couch, wrapping her in a blanket. He sat beside her, holding her close. "Tell me everything, Mia. What exactly happened?" Mia sniffled and began to explain. "We were in class, and Mr. Callaway said I wasn't paying attention. He got really mad and told me to stand up. Then he said I didn't deserve to wear clothes because I was acting like a baby. He made me take off my dress and put on a diaper. Everyone laughed at me, Daddy. I was so scared." Shaq clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had always been a protective father, but this was different. This wasn't just a playground bully or a mean kid. This was an adult, someone in a position of authority, humiliating his little girl. Shaq knew he had to do something, and fast. "Mia, listen to me," he said, looking into her eyes. "What Mr. Callaway did was wrong. Very wrong. Daddy's going to make sure he never does that to you or anyone else again. Okay?" Mia nodded, her tears slowing down. Shaq gave her a tight hug, his mind already planning his next steps. He knew he couldn't let this slide. As a father, it was his job to protect his children. And as someone with a platform, he knew he had the power to make a difference. Later that evening, after putting Mia to bed, Shaq sat in his home office, staring at his computer screen. He typed Mr. Callaway into the search bar, hoping to find some information about the teacher. To his surprise, he found a few articles about complaints from other parents. One mother had accused Mr. Callaway of being too harsh with her son. Another parent claimed he had made racist remarks in class. Shaq's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about all the kids who had been hurt by this man. Shaq picked up his phone and called his lawyer. "Hey, it's Shaq. I need your help with something. It's about Mia's school." The next morning, Shaq drove Mia to school, but this time, he wasn't dropping her off. He was going in. He parked his car and walked into the building, his presence immediately drawing attention. The staff recognized him instantly, and whispers filled the hallway. "Is that Shaq O'Neal? What's he doing here?" Shaq ignored the stares and headed straight to the principal's office. He knocked on the door and walked in without waiting for a response. The principal, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Thompson, looked up in surprise. "Mr. O'Neal, what brings you here today?" she asked, trying to sound polite but clearly nervous. Shaq didn't waste any time. "My daughter Mia came home yesterday wearing nothing but a diaper. Her teacher, Mr. Callaway, humiliated her in front of the entire class. I want to know what you're going to do about it." Mrs. Thompson's face turned pale. I had no idea. This is the first I'm hearing of this." "Well, now you know," Shaq said firmly, "and I'm not leaving until something is done." Mrs. Thompson nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. O'Neal. I'll look into this immediately. I promise you, we take these matters very seriously." Shaq crossed his arms, his expression stern. "You'd better. Because if I find out this school is protecting a man who abuses children, there's going to be hell to pay." As Shaq left the school, he felt a mix of anger and determination. He knew this was just the beginning. Mr. Callaway had messed with the wrong family, and Shaq wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Shaq couldn't shake the image of Mia's tear-streaked face from his mind. He'd always been a man of action, and sitting around waiting for the school to investigate wasn't his style. He needed answers, now. After dropping Mia off at a trusted friend's house, Shaq drove back to the school, his mind racing with questions. What kind of teacher would humiliate a child like that? And why had no one stopped him before? When Shaq arrived at the school, he didn't bother with pleasantries. He marched straight to Mr. Callaway's classroom. The door was slightly ajar, and Shaq could hear the teacher's voice inside, sharp and condescending. "If you can't follow the rules, you don't deserve to be treated like a human being. Understand?" Shaq's blood boiled. He pushed the door open and the entire class fell silent. Mr. Callaway, a thin man with a receding hairline, turned around, his eyes widening when he saw Shaq standing there. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to sound authoritative but failing to hide the tremor in his voice. Shaq stepped inside, his towering frame filling the room. "Yeah, you can help me," he said, his voice low but firm. "You can explain why you thought it was okay to humiliate my daughter in front of her classmates." The students exchanged nervous glances, some of them whispering to each other. Mr. Callaway cleared his throat. "I don't know what you're talking about. Your daughter was disruptive, and I simply disciplined her." "Disciplined her?" Shaq repeated, his voice rising. "You made her strip down to a diaper in front of everyone. That's not discipline. That's abuse." Mr. Callaway's face turned red. She was acting out. And Shaq cut him off. "Save it. I've heard enough. You're not fit to be around kids, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." The teacher's confidence wavered, and he took a step back. "You can't just barge in here and accuse me of something like that. I have rights." Shaq leaned in, his eyes locked on Mr. Callaway's. "And my daughter has the right to feel safe in her own classroom. But you took that away from her. So, don't talk to me about rights." The tension in the room was palpable. One of the students, a brave little boy, raised his hand. "Mr. O'Neal? He does this kind of stuff all the time. He's always yelling at us and making us feel bad." Shaq turned to the boy, his expression softening. "Thank you for speaking up, son. You're brave to do that." Mr. Callaway's face turned pale. "This is ridiculous. I'm calling security." "Go ahead," Shaq said, crossing his arms. "Call them. I'll wait." A few minutes later, the principal, Mrs. Thompson, rushed into the classroom, flanked by 2 security guards. "Mr. O'Neal, please, let's handle this calmly," she said, her voice trembling. Shaq turned to her. Calmly? My daughter was humiliated by this man, and you want me to be calm? What I want is for you to do your job and protect these kids. Mrs. Thompson nodded quickly. Of course, Mr. O'Neill. We're taking this very seriously. Mr. Callaway will be placed on immediate leave while we investigate. Mr. Callaway's jaw dropped. You can't do that. I haven't done anything wrong. Shaq stepped closer to him, his voice like steel. You've done plenty wrong. And if I find out you've hurt any other kids, you're going to regret it. The teacher shrank back, his bravado completely gone. Mrs. Thompson gestured for the security guards to escort him out of the classroom. As Mr. Callaway left, the students erupted into applause. Shaq turned to them, his expression serious but kind. Listen up, kids, he said. No one has the right to make you feel small or worthless. Not your teachers, not anyone. If someone ever treats you like that, you speak up. You tell your parents, your principal, someone you trust. Don't stay silent, okay? The kids nodded, their faces filled with admiration. Shaq gave them a small smile before turning to leave. As he walked out of the classroom, he felt a sense of relief, but also a lingering anger. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Later that day, Shaq met with his lawyer to discuss the next steps. We need to dig deeper, Shaq said. There's something off about this guy. I can feel it. His lawyer nodded. I'll start looking into his background. If there's anything in his past, we'll find it. Shaq leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He thought about Mia and how scared she must have felt. He thought about the other kids in that classroom who had been silently suffering under Mr. Callaway's abuse. And he thought about the parents who had no idea what was happening to their children. This isn't just about Mia, Shaq said quietly. This is about all of them. We have to make sure this never happens again. His lawyer nodded again. We will, Shaq. We'll get to the bottom of this. As Shaq left the office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had always used his platform to help others, whether it was through charity work or community events. But this was different. This was personal, and Shaq wasn't going to stop until justice was served, not just for Mia, but for every child who had ever been hurt by someone they were supposed to trust. Shaq sat in his living room later that evening, his laptop open on the coffee table. The house was quiet. Mia was asleep, and the rest of the family had gone to bed. But Shaq couldn't sleep. His mind was racing, replaying the confrontation with Mr. Callaway and the fear in Mia's eyes. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to wait for the school to figure things out. He opened his email and saw a message from his lawyer. The subject line read, "Preliminary findings on Mr. Callaway." Shaq clicked on it immediately. The email was brief but alarming. Mr. Callaway had a history of complaints from parents at his previous school. One parent had accused him of being verbally abusive, while another claimed he had made inappropriate comments about students' appearances. But what caught Shaq's attention was a note at the bottom of the email. There's also a pending investigation into possible drug-related activities at his last school. No charges were filed, but it's worth looking into. Shaq leaned back, his heart pounding. Drugs? In a school? He thought about Mia and the other kids. If Mr. Callaway was involved in something like that, it was even more serious than he had imagined. The next morning, Shaq called his lawyer. We need to dig deeper into this drug angle, he said. If this guy is bringing that stuff near kids, we have to stop him. His lawyer agreed. I'll reach out to some contacts and see what I can find. In the meantime, you might want to talk to some of the other parents. If Mr. Callaway has been doing this for a while, someone else might know something. Shaq hung up and grabbed his car keys. He wasn't going to sit around and wait. He drove to the school and parked outside, watching as parents dropped off their kids. He spotted a woman he recognized from Mia's class and approached her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Shaq O'Neal, Mia's dad. Do you have a minute to talk?" The woman looked surprised but nodded. "Of course. Is everything okay?" Shaq explained what had happened with Mia and Mr. Callaway. The woman's face darkened. "That man is a nightmare," she said. "My son came home crying last week because Mr. Callaway yelled at him for no reason. He said the teacher called him stupid in front of the whole class." Shaq's jaw tightened. "Did you report it?" The woman shook her head. "I tried, but the school didn't do anything. They said it was just tough love. But I know my son. He's not a troublemaker. He's just sensitive." Shaq nodded. "I'm sorry that happened to him. But I'm not going to let this slide. If you're willing, I'd like to talk to other parents and see if anyone else has had problems with Mr. Callaway." The woman agreed, and within an hour, Shaq had spoken to several parents. The stories were all similar. Mr. Callaway was harsh, unpredictable, and often humiliated students in front of their peers. But one parent mentioned something that made Shaq's blood run cold. "My daughter came home with a bag of candy last week," the man said. "She said Mr. Callaway gave it to her as a reward. But when I looked at it, the packaging was torn, and some of the candies looked off. I threw it away, but now I'm wondering if I should have reported it." Shaq's mind raced. Candy? Laced with something? He thanked the man and immediately called his lawyer. "We need to get those candies tested," he said. "If Mr. Callaway is giving kids drugs, this is way bigger than we thought." A few days later, the test results came back. The candies were indeed laced with a small amount of a controlled substance. Shaq felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't just about abuse anymore. This was about endangering children's lives. He called the principal, Mrs. Thompson, and demanded an emergency meeting. When he arrived at the school, he was met with a somber atmosphere. Mrs. Thompson and several school board members were waiting for him in the conference room. "Mr. O'Neal," Mrs. Thompson began, her voice shaky. "We've reviewed the evidence and we're deeply disturbed by what we've found. Mr. Callaway has been placed on immediate leave, and we're cooperating fully with the authorities." Shaq nodded, but his expression was grim. "This isn't just about one teacher. This is about the safety of every child in this school. How did someone like him get hired in the first place? And why wasn't he stopped sooner?" The school board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a man in his 50s, spoke up. "We understand your concerns, Mr. O'Neal, but hiring decisions are complex, and sometimes things slip through the cracks." "Things slip through the cracks?" Shaq repeated, his voice rising. "We're talking about kids' lives here. You can't just sweep this under the rug." Mrs. Thompson held up her hands. "We're not trying to do that, Mr. O'Neal. We're taking this very seriously. We've already started a full review of our hiring and oversight processes, and we're working with law enforcement to ensure Mr. Callaway is held accountable." Shaq took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Good. But this isn't over. I'm going to make sure every parent in this community knows what happened here, and I'm going to make sure it never happens again." As Shaq left the school, he felt a mix of anger and determination. He had exposed Mr. Callaway, but he knew the fight wasn't over. There were still questions that needed answers. Who was supplying the drugs? How many kids had been affected? And how many other schools were dealing with similar issues? Shaq got into his car and pulled out his phone. He had a list of parents to call, a meeting with the local police chief, and a press conference to plan. This wasn't just about Mia anymore. This was about every child who had ever been hurt by someone they were supposed to trust. And Shaq wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Shaq sat in his home office, surrounded by stacks of papers and notes. His desk was a mess, but his mind was clear. He had spent the last few days juggling his roles as a father, a public figure, and now an advocate for justice. It wasn't easy, but he knew he couldn't back down. Not now. The phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was his lawyer. "Shaq, we've got something," the lawyer said, his voice urgent. "The police found a stash of laced candies in Mr. Callaway's car. They're testing them now, but it looks like he was distributing them to multiple schools." Shaq's heart sank. "Multiple schools? How many kids are we talking about?" "We don't know yet," the lawyer replied. "But it's bad, really bad. The police are widening their investigation, and they want to talk to you. They think you might be able to help." Shaq nodded, even though the lawyer couldn't see him. "Tell them I'll be there. Whatever they need, I'll do it." An hour later, Shaq was at the police station, sitting across from Detective Ramirez, the lead investigator on the case. "Mr. O'Neill, we appreciate your help," Ramirez said. "This case is bigger than we thought. We're looking at a possible drug ring operating in several schools, and Mr. Callaway seems to be at the center of it." Shaq leaned forward, his expression serious. "What can I do to help?" Ramirez handed him a folder. "We've identified a few parents whose kids might have been given the laced candies. We need someone to talk to them, someone they'll trust. That's where you come in." Shaq took the folder and flipped through it. There were names, addresses, and photos of kids, some as young as Mia. His stomach churned, but he nodded. "I'll do it, but I need to know something. How did this happen? How did a guy like Callaway get access to kids?" Ramirez sighed. "That's what we're trying to figure out. It looks like he had help, someone on the inside. We're looking into school staff, suppliers, anyone who might have been involved." Shaq clenched his fists. "You find them and you let me know. These kids deserve justice." Over the next few days, Shaq visited the families listed in the folder. It wasn't easy. Some parents were angry, others were heartbroken, but all of them were grateful that someone was finally taking action. Shaq listened to their stories, offered his support, and assured them that he wouldn't stop until the truth came out. One visit in particular stuck with him. He met a single mother named Lisa, whose 8-year-old son, Jake, had been given the laced candies. "He's been having nightmares," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "He won't eat candy anymore. He won't even go near it. And he's scared to go back to school." Shaq knelt down to Jake's level. "Hey, buddy," he said gently. "I know you're scared, but you're not alone anymore. I'm going to make sure that bad man never hurts you or anyone else again. Okay?" Jake nodded, his eyes wide. "You're really tall," he whispered. Shaq smiled. "Yeah, I am. And you know what? That means I can reach really high places, like the top of the bad guys' heads." Jake giggled, and for the first time in days, Lisa smiled, too. "Thank you, Mr. O'Neill," she said. "You have no idea how much this means to us." Shaq stood up, his expression serious. "I'm just doing what any parent would do. But we're not done yet. Not by a long shot." As Shaq left Lisa's house, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Detective Ramirez. "We've got a lead. Meet me at the station." Shaq drove straight there, his mind racing. When he arrived, Ramirez was waiting for him. "We've identified a supplier," the detective said. "A guy named Marcus Green. He's been selling laced candies to teachers and staff at multiple schools. We're bringing him in for questioning." Shaq's eyes narrowed. "And Callaway? What's he saying?" Ramirez shook his head. "He's not talking. But if we can get Green to flip, we might be able to take down the whole operation." Shaq nodded. "Let me know if there's anything else I can do." That night, Shaq sat in his living room, staring at the TV, but not really watching it. His mind was elsewhere. He thought about Mia, Jake, and all the other kids who had been hurt. He thought about the parents who had trusted the school to keep their children safe. And he thought about the people who had let this happen. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer. "I want to start a foundation," he said. "Something to help kids who've been through this kind of thing. Counseling, legal support, whatever they need. Can you help me set it up?" His lawyer didn't hesitate. "Of course, Shaq. I'll get started right away." Shaq hung up and leaned back in his chair, feeling a small sense of relief. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew he was doing everything he could to make things right. For Mia, for Jake, for all of them. Shaq sat in the conference room of a local community center, surrounded by parents, teachers, and school administrators. The room was packed, and the atmosphere was tense. This was the first public meeting since the scandal had broken, and everyone wanted answers. Shaq stood up, his towering presence immediately silencing the room. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but firm. "I know this is a difficult time for everyone, especially the families who've been affected. But we're here today to talk about how we can make sure this never happens again." A parent in the front row raised her hand. "Mr. O'Neill, how did this even happen? How did someone like Mr. Callaway get hired in the first place?" Shaq nodded. "That's a great question. And the truth is, there were warning signs, complaints from parents, reports from his previous school. None of it was taken seriously. That's a failure of the system, and it's something we need to fix." A school administrator stood up, looking defensive. "Mr. O'Neill, with all due respect, hiring decisions are complex. We can't always predict how someone will behave once they're in the classroom." Shaq fixed the man with a hard stare. "But you can do better. Background checks, reference checks, regular evaluations, these things exist for a reason. If we're not using them properly, then we're failing our kids." The room erupted into applause, and Shaq waited for it to die down before continuing. "This isn't just about one bad teacher. It's about a system that's broken. And if we don't fix it, more kids are going to get hurt." After the meeting, Shaq met with a group of parents who had formed a coalition to push for change. They called themselves Parents for Safe Schools, and they were determined to hold the school district accountable. "We need stricter hiring policies," one parent said. "And we need transparency. Parents should know if a teacher has a history of complaints." Another parent nodded. "And we need better support for kids who've been through something like this. Counseling, therapy, whatever they need." Shaq listened carefully, taking notes. "I agree with all of that, and I'll do everything I can to support you. But we also need to think bigger. This isn't just about one school or one district. This is a nationwide problem." The parents exchanged glances, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of the issue. "So what do we do?" one of them asked. Shaq leaned forward, his expression determined. "We start here. We make changes in our community, and then we take that model to other places. We work with lawmakers, we raise awareness, and we don't stop until every school is a safe place for kids." Over the next few weeks, Shaq threw himself into the effort. He met with school board members, lobbied local politicians, and even testified at a state hearing on education reform. His foundation, which he named Safe Kids, Strong Futures, began offering counseling and legal support to families affected by the scandal. But it wasn't easy. There was resistance at every turn. Budget concerns, bureaucratic red tape, and even pushback from some teachers who felt unfairly targeted. Shaq knew he couldn't please everyone, but he refused to back down. One evening after a long day of meetings, Shaq sat down with Mia to talk about everything that had happened. "Daddy, are you mad at me?" she asked, her voice small. Shaq's heart broke. "No, baby, of course not. Why would you think that?" Mia looked down at her hands. Because I told you about Mr. Callaway, and now you're always busy. Shaq pulled her into a hug. Mia, you did the right thing by telling me, and I'm so proud of you. I'm busy because I want to make sure no one else has to go through what you did. But that doesn't mean I'm mad at you. Okay? Mia nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Okay. Shaq held her tight, feeling a surge of determination. This was why he was doing all of this. For Mia, and for every kid who deserved to feel safe at school. As the weeks turned into months, the changes began to take effect. The school district implemented stricter hiring policies, including mandatory background checks and regular evaluations. Parents were given more transparency, and a hotline was set up for reporting concerns. Shaq's foundation expanded, offering resources to schools and families across the state. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. And Shaq knew that as long as he kept fighting, things would keep getting better. Shaq sat in a small, cozy room at his foundation's headquarters, surrounded by a group of children. They were all victims of abuse or discrimination at school, and they had come together for a special counseling session. The room was filled with colorful drawings, toys, and beanbag chairs. But the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken pain. Shaq knelt down to their level, his voice gentle. Hey everyone, I know this might feel a little scary, but I want you to know that you're safe here. This is a place where you can talk about anything that's bothering you. No one's going to judge you or make fun of you, okay? The kids nodded, some of them looking down at their feet. One little girl named Emma raised her hand. Mr. Shaq, can I say something? Of course, sweetheart, Shaq said, giving her an encouraging smile. Emma took a deep breath. My teacher used to say mean things to me. She said I was dumb and that I'd never be good at math. It made me feel really bad. Shaq's heart ached for her. I'm so sorry that happened to you, Emma. But you know what? You're not dumb. You're smart, and you're brave for speaking up. And I'm proud of you. Another boy named Lucas spoke up. My teacher used to make fun of my stutter. He said I sounded like a broken robot. I didn't want to talk in class anymore. Shaq's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. Lucas, your voice matters. No one has the right to make you feel bad about how you speak. You're amazing, just the way you are. The kids began to open up one by one, sharing their stories. Some talked about being bullied by teachers, others about being excluded or humiliated in front of their classmates. Shaq listened carefully, offering words of encouragement and support. After the session, Shaq met with the counselors to discuss how they could help the kids heal. They've been through so much, one counselor said. It's going to take time, but we're seeing progress. They're starting to trust again. Shaq nodded. That's what matters. We need to give them a safe space to heal and grow. And we need to make sure they know they're not alone. Later that day, Shaq visited Mia's school to check on the changes that had been implemented. He walked through the hallways, observing the new posters that promoted kindness and respect. He peeked into classrooms where teachers were using positive reinforcement instead of punishment. One teacher, Mrs. Alvarez, approached him with a smile. Mr. O'Neill, I just wanted to thank you. Your advocacy has made a huge difference here. The kids are happier, and the atmosphere is so much better. Shaq smiled back. That's great to hear, but we can't stop here. We need to keep pushing for more changes, not just in this school, but everywhere. Mrs. Alvarez nodded. I agree, and I'll do whatever I can to help. As Shaq left the school, he thought about the kids he had met that day. They were resilient, but they shouldn't have to be. They deserved to feel safe and supported, not just in school, but in every aspect of their lives. He got into his car and pulled out his phone. There was a message from Detective Ramirez. We've made an arrest in the drug case. Call me. Shaq dialed the number immediately. "What's the update?" he asked. "We've arrested Marcus Green, the supplier," Ramirez said. "He's cooperating, and we're closing in on the rest of the network. This is a big win, Shaq." Shaq felt a surge of relief. "That's great news. But we're not done yet. We need to make sure this never happens again." Ramirez agreed. "We're working on it, and we couldn't have done it without your help." That night, Shaq sat down with Mia to talk about everything that had happened. "Daddy, are the bad guys gone?" she asked, her eyes wide. Shaq smiled and ruffled her hair. "Yeah, baby, the bad guys are gone, and we're going to make sure they don't come back." Mia hugged him tightly. "I'm glad you're my daddy." Shaq's eyes filled with tears. "I'm glad you're my daughter, Mia. And I'm so proud of you." The sun was setting as Shaq stood on the stage of a packed community center. The room was filled with parents, teachers, students, and local leaders, all gathered for a town hall meeting organized by Shaq's foundation, Safe Kids, Strong Futures. The energy in the room was a mix of hope and frustration. Hope for change, but frustration at how long it had taken to get here. Shaq adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his deep voice resonating through the room. "We're here because of something that should never have happened. Kids being hurt by the very people who were supposed to protect them. But we're also here because we have the power to make sure it never happens again." The crowd erupted into applause, and Shaq waited for it to die down before continuing. "This isn't just about one school or one teacher. This is about all of us. It's about creating a community where our kids feel safe, where they can learn and grow without fear. And it's about holding people accountable when they fail our children." A man in the audience raised his hand. "Mr. O'Neill, what can we do as parents to make sure our kids are safe?" Shaq nodded. "Great question. First, talk to your kids. Really talk to them. Ask them how they're feeling, what's happening at school, and if anyone's making them uncomfortable. Second, get involved. Go to school board meetings, join parent-teacher associations, and make your voice heard. And third, if you see something, say something. Don't wait for someone else to take action." A woman stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. "But what if the school doesn't listen? What if they brush us off like they did with Mr. Callaway?" Shaq's expression softened. "I know how frustrating that is. Believe me, I've been there. But that's why we're here tonight, to make sure no one gets brushed off again. My foundation is working with the school district to create a new system for reporting and addressing concerns. And we're pushing for laws that will hold schools accountable for protecting our kids." The crowd erupted into applause again, and Shaq felt a surge of determination. This was what it was all about, bringing people together, giving them the tools to fight for their children, and showing them that they weren't alone. After the meeting, Shaq stayed behind to talk to parents and answer questions. One mother, holding a toddler in her arms, approached him with tears in her eyes. "Mr. O'Neill, I just want to thank you. My son is only 2, but I'm already scared for him. Hearing you talk tonight, it gives me hope." Shaq smiled and gently patted the toddler's head. "You don't have to thank me. This is what we're supposed to do. Look out for each other, especially our kids. And don't be scared. We're going to make things better, one step at a time." The next morning, Shaq met with a group of local leaders to discuss next steps. They had a long list of goals: stricter hiring policies for schools, mandatory training for teachers on recognizing and preventing abuse, and a statewide hotline for reporting concerns. But Shaq knew they couldn't do it alone. "We need to get the word out," he said. "Not just here, but everywhere. This isn't just our problem. It's happening in schools across the country. We need to start a movement." One of the leaders, a woman named Dr. Patel, nodded. "I agree. But how do we do that? How do we get people to care?" Shaq leaned forward, his eyes blazing with determination. "We tell the stories. We show them what's happening to these kids, and we make it clear that if they don't act, it could be their child next. Over the next few weeks, Shaq and his team launched a nationwide campaign called Protect Our Kids. They created videos featuring parents and children sharing their stories, organized rallies in cities across the country, and even got celebrities to join the cause. The campaign went viral, and soon, people everywhere were talking about the need for change. Shaq also worked with lawmakers to draft new legislation. The Safe Schools Act would require schools to conduct thorough background checks on all staff, provide mandatory training on child protection, and establish clear protocols for reporting and addressing abuse. It was a big step, but Shaq knew it was necessary. One evening, as Shaq sat in his office reviewing the latest updates, Mia walked in. "Daddy, can I talk to you?" she asked, her voice quiet. Shaq set down his papers and smiled. "Of course, baby. What's on your mind?" Mia climbed onto his lap and looked up at him. "Are you still mad at Mr. Callaway?" Shaq's heart ached. He had tried to shield Mia from the worst of it, but he knew she could sense his anger. "I'm not mad at him anymore, Mia. I'm just sad. Sad that he hurt you and other kids. But I'm also proud of you for being so brave." Mia nodded. "I'm glad you're my daddy." Shaq hugged her tightly. "I'm glad you're my daughter, Mia. And I'm going to keep fighting to make sure no one ever hurts you again." As Shaq tucked Mia into bed that night, he felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was long, and there were still battles to fight. But he knew they were on the right path. Together, they were making a difference, not just for Mia, but for kids everywhere. Shaq sat in a small, dimly lit conference room, surrounded by a team of investigators, lawyers, and community leaders. The mood was tense but focused. On the table in front of them were stacks of documents, photos, and evidence related to the drug operation that had been uncovered through the investigation into Mr. Callaway. What had started as a fight to protect Mia and other children had grown into something much larger, a fight against a network that was exploiting kids and poisoning communities. Detective Ramirez pointed to a map on the wall, marked with red pins. "This is what we're dealing with," he said. "The laced candies were just the tip of the iceberg. We've traced the operation to multiple schools, and it's connected to a larger drug ring that's been operating under the radar for years." Shaq leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "How many kids are we talking about?" Ramirez sighed. "Hundreds, maybe more. And it's not just here. This is happening in other states too. They're targeting schools because kids are vulnerable. They don't know what they're being given, and they trust the adults who give it to them." Shaq's fists clenched under the table. The thought of someone using kids as pawns in a drug operation made him sick to his stomach. "We have to shut this down, now." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Shaq worked closely with law enforcement, using his platform to draw attention to the issue and pressure officials to take action. He held press conferences, appeared on national news programs, and even testified before Congress. At one hearing, a senator asked him, "Mr. O'Neill, why is this issue so important to you? You're a basketball legend, a businessman, a philanthropist. Why are you spending so much time on this?" Shaq looked directly at the senator, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Because this isn't just about me. It's about every parent who's ever trusted a school to keep their child safe. It's about every kid who's ever been hurt by someone they were supposed to trust. And it's about every community that's been torn apart by drugs and violence. If we don't stop this now, it's only going to get worse." The room fell silent, and for a moment, even the senator seemed at a loss for words. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Your passion is inspiring." As the investigation deepened, Shaq began to see the bigger picture. The drug operation wasn't just about money, it was about power. It was about exploiting the most vulnerable members of society and using them to fuel a cycle of addiction and crime. And it was about people in positions of authority turning a blind eye to what was happening right under their noses. One evening, Shaq met with a group of parents whose kids had been affected by the laced candies. They sat in a circle, sharing their stories and supporting each other. One father, named Carlos, spoke up. "My son was given those candies. He's only 7 years old. He didn't know what was happening, he just thought they were a treat. Now he's in therapy, and I don't know if he'll ever be the same." Shaq's heart ached for Carlos and his son. "I'm so sorry," he said. "But I want you to know that we're not going to stop until everyone responsible is held accountable. And we're going to make sure this never happens again." Carlos nodded, tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Thank you for fighting for our kids." As the weeks turned into months, the investigation began to yield results. Dozens of arrests were made, and the drug ring was dismantled piece by piece. Shaq's foundation, Safe Kids, Strong Futures, expanded its efforts to include drug prevention programs, counseling for affected families, and advocacy for stronger laws to protect children. But Shaq knew the fight wasn't over. The root causes of the problem, poverty, lack of education, and systemic inequality, were still there. And until those issues were addressed, kids would continue to be at risk. One night, as Shaq sat in his living room, Mia climbed onto the couch beside him. "Daddy, are you still fighting the bad guys?" she asked. Shaq smiled and put his arm around her. "Yeah, baby, I'm still fighting, but we're winning. And you know why?" Mia shook her head. "Why?" "Because of you," Shaq said. "You're the reason I started this fight, and you're the reason I'm not going to stop until every kid is safe." Mia smiled and snuggled closer to him. "I'm glad you're my daddy." Shaq kissed the top of her head. "I'm glad you're my daughter, Mia. And I'm so proud of you." As Shaq sat there, holding Mia close, he felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was long, and there were still battles to fight. But he knew they were making a difference. Together, they were creating a safer, better world for kids everywhere. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict. Shaq sat in the front row, his hands clasped tightly together. Beside him were Mia, Carlos, and other parents whose children had been affected by the laced candies and the abuse at school. The tension in the room was palpable. "We find the defendant, Marcus Green, guilty on all charges," the judge declared, his voice firm. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Marcus Green, the supplier behind the drug operation, slumped in his seat, his face pale. Shaq felt a surge of satisfaction, but also a deep sense of responsibility. This was a victory, but it was only one step in a much larger fight. After the trial, Shaq stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and cameras. He held Mia's hand tightly as he addressed the crowd. Today, justice was served. But this isn't just about one man or one case. This is about protecting our kids and making sure no one else has to go through what these families have endured. A reporter shouted a question. "Mr. O'Neill, what's next for you and your foundation?" Shaq looked down at Mia, who smiled up at him, then back at the cameras. "We're not stopping here. We're going to keep fighting for stronger laws, better schools, and safer communities. We're going to make sure every child has the chance to grow up safe, happy, and healthy." The crowd erupted into applause, and Shaq felt a swell of pride. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready for the challenge. Over the next few months, Shaq's foundation, Safe Kids, Strong Futures, became a driving force for change. They worked with lawmakers to pass the Safe Schools Act, which mandated stricter background checks for school staff mandatory training on child protection, and clear protocols for reporting abuse. They also launched nationwide drug prevention programs and provided counseling and support for affected families. Shaq traveled across the country, speaking at schools, community centers, and conferences. His message was simple, but powerful. Our kids are our future, and it's up to us to protect them. One evening, Shaq sat in his living room flipping through a photo album. There were pictures of Mia's first day of school, family vacations, and community events. He paused at a photo of Mia holding a sign that read, "Thank you, Daddy, for keeping us safe." Mia walked in and sat beside him. "What are you looking at, Daddy?" Shaq smiled and showed her the photo. "Just remembering how far we've come." Mia grinned. "You're my hero, Daddy." Shaq's eyes filled with tears. "And you're mine, Mia. You're the reason I do all of this." As the months turned into years, the impact of Shaq's work became clear. Schools were safer, kids were happier, and communities were stronger. The fight wasn't over, but Shaq knew they had made a difference. And he knew they would keep fighting for Mia and for every child who deserved a better future. Years later, Shaq stood on a stage, accepting an award for his work with safe kids, strong futures. Mia, now a teenager, sat in the front row, beaming with pride. "This award isn't just for me," Shaq said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's for every parent, every teacher, and every kid who stood up and said, 'Enough is enough.' It's for my daughter Mia, who taught me what it means to fight for what's right. And it's for all the kids out there who deserve to grow up safe, happy, and loved." The crowd rose to their feet, applauding and cheering. Shaq looked out at the sea of faces, his heart full. He had started this journey as a father fighting for his daughter, but along the way he had become a voice for millions of kids and families. As he left the stage, Mia ran up to him and hugged him tightly. "I'm so proud of you, Daddy." Shaq smiled and hugged her back. "I'm proud of you too, Mia, and I'm so grateful to have you by my side." And so, the story of Shaq's fight for justice came to a close. Not with an ending, but with a new beginning. A beginning where kids could go to school without fear, where parents could trust the system, and where communities could come together to protect their most vulnerable members. Shaq had started as a father, but he had become a hero, and his legacy would live on, not just in the laws he helped pass or the programs he created, but in the hearts of every child he had touched. I hope you like this story. Write your thoughts in the comment section. Also, subscribe the channel for daily upcoming stories like this.